When Nelson Mandela was born, he was known as Roholia, and in Nelson Mandela's language of Xhosa, his name means troublemaker. His father, Chief Thembu, was the leader of his people. At age 7, Nelson Mandela went to school. He went to a mission school. His teacher gave him an English name, and that English name was, well, you guessed it, Nelson Mandela. On his 9th birthday, his father grew ill and died, so his mother sent him with a family friend, Chief Jongi, his Uncle Jongi, or known as Uncle Jongi. Later on in life, when he was 21, Nelson Mandela went to Fort Hare University, a university for blacks. In his life, his Uncle Jongi was going to marry him off. He already picked a wife, so Nelson Mandela ran away to Johannesburg and joined the ANC because of the fight to free South Africans. As Nelson Mandela grew up, he noticed that Africans were poor and powerless. After opening up their own black law firm, Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo helped black people avoid the punishments of the apartheid and defend the people who could not defend themselves. In 1948, white Afrikaners voted for Dr. D.F. Malana, a white supremacist who served as prime minister from 1948 to 1954. He promised to bring the apartheid into action, or total racial segregation, to the entire country. People thought this was unfair, so they protested. And Nelson Mandela gathered crowds to help protest the apartheid. Nelson Mandela's wife, Winifred Madikizela, was also known as Winnie Mandela. She was an apartheid fighter. She also helped stop the apartheid as well. Nelson Mandela traveled around the country to rally up a resistance campaign. On March 21, 1960, the South African police killed 69 men and women, children who had been peacefully protesting the passed laws. They also wounded 186 people. This event is now known as the Sharpeville Massacre. It showed the world that the South African government didn't respect peaceful protest. Most of the people in the massacre had been shot in the back. These people were not trying to hurt the police, but trying to flee. The United Nations Security Council accused the South African government of responsibility for these murders. The world was starting to speak out against the apartheid. South Africa was still not allowing its residents to speak out against the apartheid. South Africans faced banning, house arrest, and imprisonment, disappearance, and even death after the incidents in Sharpeville. The police cracked down. Nelson Mandela and many others were arrested and imprisoned. In 1961, when he was released from prison, Nelson Mandela helped to form a group called the Umkhonto Wezindawo, or the Spear of the Nation. This organization was also known as the ANC, or African National Congress. Since the peaceful protest did not work, the ANC tried a more aggressive approach, so they decided to bomb government buildings. They did not aim to kill innocent people, but instead target buildings that represented the apartheid. In order to fight against the apartheid, Mandela had to work underground. He put on disguises to avoid arrest. These disguises included gardener, chauffeur, which were common jobs for black people in South Africa. He also moved from one safe house to another. Even though he took many precautions, he could not evade the South African government for long.
He was arrested in 1962 and was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor in Pretoria prison. This was the start of his 27 years in jail. While he was still serving his 5-year sentence, he was accused of sabotage and attempting to overthrow the government. In 1976, a rebellion began with the children of Soweto. The Soweto township sparked a revolt that spread across the entire country into the next 10 years. Once the student-led rebellion had started, It was practically unstoppable. Many parents returning from work joined their kids. Huge numbers of black South Africans demonstrated against the white Afrikaner government. The students of Soweto wanted Nelson Mandela to be set free. They also protested against the nationalist government's rule that school must be taught in the Afrikaans language. The language issue was very important. The Afrikaans language was a Dutch-based language. Many African students did not understand other Afrikaans. Afrikaners gave black Africans apartheid and also wanted to give them Afrikaans and take away English and the African language. This was the white Afrikaner dream of Bantu education. But for black Africans, however, it was a long nightmare. A demonstrator named Hector Peterson was the first victim to be shot. The children fled from the police, throwing anything they could at them, including rocks, book bags, and more. Some children tried to protect themselves from the gunfire by using the lids of trash cans. Fires burned and dead bodies lay in the streets. The South African police had killed between 700 and 1,000 demonstrators. The police had many weapons like automatic rifles, shotguns, tear gas, and German Shepherd dogs. The demonstrators only had stones. Violent clashes between the white police and African demonstrators increased in the 1980s. The violence between black Africans had also risen as well. Whenever a demonstrator was killed, there were huge African funeral processions. The police considered these funerals a type of protest, so these funerals became targets for violent police attacks. Protests inside and outside the country grew. Support for Nelson Mandela grew as well. People helped to raise money for the fight against apartheid. Though he was still in jail, Nelson Mandela was much closer to freedom. The South African government knew that they had to work with him to save their country, but they also knew that he would only work with them if he did it as a free man who had been promised the freedom of his people, the freedom of all South Africans. As the years passed, the new president of Africa agreed to take down all of the European signs for good. Beaches, parks, and movie theaters were not only for Europeans again. Apartheid was finally put to an end, and Nelson's people were finally set free. When Nelson Mandela was much older, he was finally released from prison. Millions of people voted Nelson Mandela to be their new leader. South Africa was free at last, and was peaceful again. The world celebrated this great accomplishment. Nelson Mandela became the first South African president. He later got the country of South Africa to be a rainbow country. Nelson Mandela later died on December 5th, 2013.